Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Bevington Group webinar. And this morning, we're going to be talking about why you need an AI strategy. But before I kick off, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So today we're going to be talking about why you need an AI strategy. I have talked a little bit about this before, but we're going to be deep diving a little bit more based on what we see in the market and in both our operating model practice and our process practice, as well as the digitization practice. We're seeing a lot of this. We see different approaches and combinations to AI. We'll talk about some of them as we progress through the reasons that you need to consciously make some decisions about this. Now, we've thought this for some while, but the reasoning becomes much more obvious and the evidence is more clear as we progress. So we'll make a start. I'd just say, though, you won't need to take notes. We will actually post the slides afterwards. You can certainly take notes on what I say, but you won't need to worry too much about the slide content. And I will make a go at this now. Okay. So we're going to be covering what is an AI strategy, the complexities of AI deployment, what happens when you deploy without a strategy, additional benefits of a strategy, and how do we recommend you proceed. So, and we do need to define what an AI strategy is because we mean a very specific thing. So AI strategy, we're going to talk about architecture, focus areas, and operating model, because the way we think about an AI strategy is that you need three big blocks, and there are lots of subcomponents to this. Now, of course, there are lots of definition for strategy, but essentially, a strategy's, we're going to keep a simple definition here, how you achieve an objective. And if your objective is to actually, in terms of technology, use AI to accelerate your strategy, and we're going to talk about strategic link, then that can be an objective itself. So AI should be effectively, the AI strategy should be a subcomponent of your regular strategy, and it needs to be in three parts. Unsurprisingly, I'll start in that middle part, which is the focus area, because you're going to have to figure out where to play. And as we'll talk about, you have to figure out where to play for all sorts of reasons, including cost, and including energy, and including attention. Because to get some of the really material benefits from AI, it's quite clear that you need all of those things. So that cost, energy, and attention needs to be focused. I'm going to do that in a little bit more detail. And that's unsurprising because strategies are often about what you don't do as much as what you do. There are choices, and you make choices here. There are also, however, choices to be made in the AI architecture. This is what are the policies that you set? What are the standards that you set? What rules should people adhere to, including what externally hosted systems you are prepared to use? What comes in behind your garden wall, your walled garden, so that it's safe and the data's safe, what partnerships you use, therefore what technologies you use, and so forth. That's your AI architecture, including items like the data that you use. And then operating model, and there are two parts to this. How do you set yourself up so that you can actually deploy AI? And there are many different types of it, which is one of the complexities. And then also, what differences will AI make to your operating model? And should you be doing things like workforce planning to really prepare yourself for the emerging changes to come? Now, as I talk about this, only a few weeks ago, basically OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, launched O1. Now, O1 is a reasoning engine. Now, why do I pause for thought here to mention this in regards to operating model? It's an example of how quickly things are moving. So up to date, large language models like ChatGPT effectively were large statistical engines. I oversimplify a bit, but large statistical engines. The challenge is that they can produce hallucinations and some interesting results. O1 is claimed to be, and it very much looks like it, able to do reasoning. Now, it's limited and it's constrained, but nonetheless, it appears to reason. That's an example of how quickly things are moving. So if this is the definition of what we mean by AI architecture, i.e., a relatively fulsome exposition of these three, Let's deep dive a bit. So a clear and comprehensive understanding of the AI architecture, you would, at the very least, and there are more components, have to deal with the following: what infrastructure, what data, what partners, products, and APIs. Now, for those who are following the AI press and the AI literature closely, certainly large players are doing well in this space because they have the scale to ingest and work with the data. They can actually access the data. They can afford the processing power. And I've often said that one of the big winners will be data centers, and that appears to be this case as there are predictions of literally trillions of dollars being poured into data centers up to 2027. And who knows after that? And indeed, it's happening here in Australia too, because many Australian enterprises will demand that data is kept, and processing even is kept on shore. So these are key decisions that you have to make. So who are you playing with and under what conditions? And if it's not your major provider, what are the rules for bringing in another provider, and what are the standards that you set? This includes basic things like, can your staff use external non-walled garden providers? Now, by the walled garden, I should be clear, we mean that you're actually running your models, your AI models, inside your, it's like on-prem, inside your network, so to speak. It's the equivalent of being behind a firewall, but in AI terms. So all of this thinking needs to be done, and you can evolve it and change it over time, but it certainly needs to be done. So systems, rules, that will relate to your risk appetite, confidentiality and privacy. You'll have to think about how to govern it. To what extent have you got new governance bodies? To what extent are you actually building this into existing governance bodies? We're actually increasingly finding building it into existing is a sensible idea, just because of governance overload that organizations are often facing. And anyway, everybody kind of needs to learn about this. It doesn't mean you leave them as is, you can adjust them, but building too much new infrastructure, you just get a governance overload. And then people, capability and education, culture and change management. How are you teaching your people? How are you enabling your people? How are you explaining to people what is going to happen? So all of this requires some thought. The good news is there are plenty of examples around of really good work in this space. So it's not particularly difficult to get done relatively quickly, or at least to get up to a standing start. But nonetheless, there are actual decisions to be made there, things you'll do, things you won't do. And some of the decisions will depend on your focus areas. And that's particularly the case as to what infrastructure you set up, because you can set up more or less. You can set up infrastructure for many, many focus areas, or you can set up infrastructure for very targeted focus areas. So let's move on to this. So choosing your focus areas, as I've said, should relate to your strategy. So an AI strategy can't stand alone. So your focus areas, that means what use cases. What will you actually use AI for? And bear in mind, as we're going to come to in a few minutes' time, there are many different types. Link it to your broader strategy. So you might use AI to enhance operational efficiency, to grow your presence in the market, to help with your marketing and sales, or develop entirely new product lines, as you said on the right-hand side. So if we go to the left-hand side, where your focus will depend on your broader business strategy, what are you trying to do? So if you were, for example, intending to be the lowest cost provider in a particular market, you may very well be tempted to focus on operational efficiency. Your value driver tree. We'll talk about this in a bit more depth, but you break down whatever your objective is, whatever your primary objective is, into its component parts, and choose the place to play in those component parts that you think is most relevant and will have the biggest impact related to your strategy, as I said. So you might, for example, if you were focused on being the lowest cost provider, focus on operational efficiency, you could also grow market presence as well, but let's assume you're doing that for now. And you may be looking at your operational cost or even your cost of sales and actually focusing on that part of your value driver tree. And we're going to go into value driver trees in a moment. Your risk appetite. Now, risk is a rapidly maturing discipline. Now, you'll all be familiar with, pretty much everyone listening in on this should have come across various instances of risk management disciplines. And organizations have different levels of maturity. Often organizations will define a risk appetite, and We say often because not everybody necessarily does, as certainly as we define it. There's a broader way to think about risk, which is not just managing your risk, but choosing what risks you take and to what extent. We call that risk intelligence, and your risk appetite statement is a reflection of that risk intelligence. So where you choose to take risk is important. If your organization, for example, has certain capabilities but not others, where you're completely fresh into a market that requires, for example, very high investment, you don't know the market, you're facing higher risk, and you need to use your risk intelligence to see whether it's worthwhile. So risk intelligence is basically where you're going to take the risks. It's not entirely that, but it's a good summation. Rather than risk management, you've got to use that to figure out whether this is a smart play where you're choosing to focus. And the mix of capabilities you can bring to bear. So sometimes some forms of use case, so some forms of focus area are, for example, simply too expensive or you're not ready. So if you'd like to change something in the way you do business, but that requires an enormous amount of data, and your data is disorganized, inaccurate, or otherwise in some form of disarray, then what you're going to have to do is spend time fixing that first, potentially. Although, interestingly, AI can help you with that too. So you may be choosing to play where you can actually win and then use a staircase strategy to get to where you want to do. And by staircase strategy, you mean build something, settle it down, then build the next piece of infrastructure and implement some AI off that, settle it down. So it's improve, stabilize, improve, stabilize, improve, stabilize. So there are a number of things to think about in your strategy. And of course, for those familiar with strategy development, well, there's an awful lot of reflection here on the normal strategy process. You're thinking about what is your strategy? What are your value driver trees? How's value created? You're thinking about risk and you're thinking about the capabilities you can bring to bear at the start. So what we're encouraging is thought on this, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on why that's important. What we're also saying is that there are two ways to think about your operating model. Now, an operating model is how you piece pieces of the organization together, or how you build pieces of the organization so that they work together to achieve your mission consistent with strategy. So an organization does not work by structure alone. It does not work by technology alone. It does not work by policy alone. It works by all sorts of elements that basically work, hopefully in harmony, to be able to get the job done. And one, you've got to build an AI model, an AI operating model, if you're going to continue to use AI. And you all will continue to use AI, even if right now you're just going to be using it embedded in other products. And you'll have many of you noticed, if not all of you noticed, that your current providers are embedding AI already into software that you are already using. So that's one of the pathways for upgrades. So the other way to think about it, so way one, you've got to build an operating model for AI, roles, processes, systems, but also AI will change your operating model, which will in due course change elements of your operating model like structure. It will certainly change role design. It'll certainly change your workforce plan. It'll certainly change the way you think about data and the way you deploy technology. So it's worthwhile thinking about both of those. You might not have precise answers. And of course, because things are emerging quite rapidly, you do need to give yourself flex. Because particularly, although we think sometimes the directions are relatively clear, in that they've been directionally relatively straightforward to predict, only relatively, timing's an entirely different story. Very, very difficult to predict. Okay. Now, why do you need to think about some of these pieces so carefully, including focus areas? Because what we're saying with a focus area is don't just let 1,000 flowers bloom. You might have that strategy as part of your enablement plan. Don't just have everyone have a crack, because to really make a difference, what we're saying is you've got to actually lean in and invest. So you can certainly let people play with Copilot, get people trained, get them sensitive and aware of what's possible so they can put proposition forward, but you can't spend money everywhere or focus everywhere. So one of the reasons for this is AI has its own complexities. Now, change is always challenging, but AI has its own complexities that mean you do need to think and focus. The first thing to say is there are multiple types of AI. So there are different capabilities from computer vision, so you can do optical character recognition, through to pattern finding, through to generation of forecasts, through to pricing models, through to automation, where simple tasks are done, through to decision making, and many, many more. So there are different capabilities. There are different categorizations. So content generation or optimization, for example. So you might be using a form of large language model, a bit like ChatGPT, to generate marketing content or a letter or a response to an email. Or you might be optimizing something like your roster, which uses different types of artificial intelligence technology. And by the way, just for simplicity, although many argue it's not quite true, when I'm thinking about AI, I am also looping in machine learning. Now, I do realize for those who are more precise that you could exclude that quite reasonably from the definition, but for ease, I'm including it here. And then categorization by application. It might be a virtual assistant, it might be a chatbot, it might be key task support, various different types. So there are different types of AI, and I'll deep dive a little bit further into that in a few minutes' time. AI can be also deployed in many different places. Any part of the operating model that we've just gone through can deploy AI. And we've gone through this in previous presentations where we've actually taken the entire operating model and produced examples of existing AI models that can have an impact in that part of the operating model. So it could be process, it could be policy, it could be governance, it could be metrics, it could be system, it could be role design, it could be ways of working. All of those things and many more can be affected by AI. So lots of different types, lots of places it can be deployed. And the deployment needs vary. And you can build more of your base infrastructure or less depending on your focus area deployment plan. So you can build enough infrastructure just to manage your initial needs and a bit more, or you can build out more broadly, basically anticipating future needs, for example, needs that might require a great deal of work on data. So, as I've said, we're including machine learning in the mix here, and I know that's a little controversial for many, but essentially, you may have AI or machine learning operations teams that you need to build. You may need teams set aside, or at least people set aside, to actually train artificial intelligence agents. And of course, training, for many of you will know, is an important part of how particularly generative AI infrastructure works, but other forms as well. And of course, you've got to think about the change management infrastructure that you need to build and model and technology stack costs. There are costs. So sometimes we get lulled into the sense that because ChatGPT seems so low cost for an individual, that the costs for deploying AI are low for an organization. That, for a whole series of reasons, which we'll talk about, is very much not the case. It can be very expensive. So you need to be able to make the business case. So let's just look at the different types of AI tools and give you some ideas as to how to categorize these. One way to think about it, and there are many ways to think about it, is you can think about the different types of tools into input, processing, and output. So you can have computer vision. So think about optical character recognition, or even actually looking at physical infrastructure and finding where there are faults and therefore predicting what might happen, and therefore perhaps actually tagging and flagging something for predictive maintenance. Computer listening, you'll be familiar with that, for example, on your phone. And computer linguistics. So let's just think about the natural language processing just for a start that we'd all be familiar with by now on something like ChatGPT. So that's input. Then there's processing, finding a pattern. So seeing something in the data that a human might not see. So that can be used for prediction, actually, because you find a pattern. If we look at the bottom, it can be used for prediction, but it can also be used for finding different markets or sub-markets, or different sets of customer needs, for example, or different types of behavior that are exhibited by customers or other agents acting in a market. And optimization. So the classic example here is rostering with large staff bases. So getting the right people to the right place at the right time in the optimal way. And then there's output. So you've got robotics and you've got content generation being the two most likely. And bear in mind that robotics increasingly use artificial intelligence, so that's physical interaction. And for Australia in particular, robotics is interesting because it has the potential to allow us to build our manufacturing based in a cost competitive way, which has been challenging for us for the past few decades. So one of the reasons you need to think strategically is because you've got choices to make. And one of the reasons you need to make choices, you've got so many options for AI. It's not just one simple bucket. Another way to think about AI is the different categories. So you can have generative, think about OpenAI's ChatGPT, optimization, as I've said. So think about algorithms that, for example, roster, schedule, or actually recommendations engines. You'll be dealing with each day on your social media feeds. Recommendation engines will use AI to serve you up something. Predictive AI, so you can predict and forecast future outcomes. This has been available for some time in machine learning, we should say. So it could be financial forecasts, disease outbreaks, natural disaster occurrences, and certainly different algorithms were used during the pandemic and are used for disease prediction. And conversational AI, chatbots, assistants. And I know I've often said that chatbots are often very poor, and it is actually difficult to deploy AI chatbots because the complexity often of what's required, but they will develop and they will emerge. Conversational AI, by the way, can happen inside and outside of the organization. So one of the often early uses of Gen AI is to basically interact with the knowledge base of an organization for internal use. So what are called small language models are often deployed as opposed to large language models, which help staff find knowledge that exists in the organization, as opposed to what you often see with ChatGPT, which is knowledge which exists on the internet. And bear in mind that much of human knowledge is behind a firewall or behind a paywall. So those models are being built and they're a very popular use case at the moment. Okay. So if you think about all of this, then you can also think and check for yourself that there are hundreds of different tools that leverage AI in some form. I don't know about yourselves, but every day someone sends me a piece of information on a new model that's available. And it's actually, in spite of my natural curiosity in this space, it's nearly impossible to keep up with everything that's actually being deployed. So you can be overcome by a tyranny of choice, just too much to choose from. So you need to have a strategic framework to know what you even spend time looking at. But there are some very, very cool applications out there. And to give you an idea of the breadth, you've got something like Cursor, an AI code generator. And for some organizations, if not many organizations that we speak to, code generation is one of the targeted areas of focus. It's one of the choices that they're making. So we consciously put that up there because there are tools emergent to help do that. Now, by the way, I'm putting these up. We're not recommending them. We're just saying they're there. So check it out for yourself. Plan Day streamlines workforce management and scheduling. We know that scheduling is very important. So you can have AI shift optimization, for example. You can have real-time adjustments to that particular roster. You can even help you with compliance and payroll management. And in Australia, with payroll complexity being what it is, it's actually one of the material risks for many boards that have large workforces, particularly large workforces that have complex EBAs and rules and systems. Very, very hard to stay on top of some of the complex EBAs that exist. And for many enterprises, it remains a real risk. There's Jasper, which automates content writing from marketing and copyright materials. Now, and I often think that often what an generative AI engine will produce is not outstanding, but a darn good start, and or it can really tidy up what you're doing already. And Cresta, which provides real-time customer service coaching and insights. So it's coaching and real-time assistance. One of the interesting emerging use cases that, again, is very is that of assisting agents who are there to assist customers. So assist people who are picking up the phone or otherwise helping customers get the right answer. So there's a lot of work being done in this space at the moment. Not always successfully, but sometimes most certainly. So to deep dive a little bit more, I've said that one of the other reasons you got to think about where to play is the complexity of impact, not just well, there's complexity, as I've just said, on what's available. There's also complexity of places it impacts. So it can affect your structure because, well, in two ways, you actually might have to build some new structural elements to be able to build and maintain the AI that you are deploying. And it's very important to remember just building and leaving it is rarely the only option that it's actually rarely the option you can deploy. You actually have to maintain, but also it can, the use of it can change your workforce. So, and frankly, the customer need, the customer expectation will change as well in the world of AI. So you're going to have to change your workforce in various ways. You'll have to think about your governance model. How do you govern this? Because work is now done by software and people, and this is a new type of software to govern. To think about data. How's that going to change? You'll have to think about the service model. In what way does AI or will AI help improve or maintain your customer service? It'll certainly impact your technology deployment, and it'll certainly potentially impact your ability to, for example, forecast and actually respond with agility. So lots of places where AI can impact your operating model. So decisions need to be made. There's just too much there. So when you actually think about this, you actually end up in a space where to deploy AI has lots of choices, but the choices are not always low cost. So you can do a small experiment at relatively low cost, but to actually deploy AI, one of the challenges is that it's actually quite costly. So here's a situation. You're training an agent to ingest potential client information and write a corresponding proposal. What would you need to ensure is in place? Confidentiality protocols, access to the right training material provided to the right agents, appropriate training of agents. And bear in mind, you don't want to train an agent here as an artificial intelligence agent. So it's an AI model, appropriate training for agents, the right data, the right training, or you get the wrong answer. Client awareness that AI has been used. This should be part of your ethical infrastructure. Thorough testing to pick up challenges like hallucinations and understanding under what circumstance a hallucination might arise. Implementation of a checking process. There's a final human review. You've got to think about the deployment. A change management process for your staff as well as your folks, and an effective trial process to ensure the model's up to date. So here's a relatively simple use case, which is being deployed live today in a number of organizations. But the reality is each of these things costs money. And that's even excluding costs like machine time, data curation, the work that it takes to actually update your training materials so that it's right before you even start ingestion, and things like tokens, which are the costs for each call, if you like, on an API. And I won't say too much more about that. It gets technical quite quickly. So all those complexities combined with the fact that there are costs mean it's worthwhile focus. So lots of choices, lots of places to go, but to actually make an impact, to get something deployed, even in simple use case, requires focus. It certainly requires money, and it certainly requires your attention. So what happens if you don't use an AI strategy? Well, it is worthwhile saying at this particular point that hype is a problem. Now, we're not saying it's not moving fast. We're actually saying that we do think things are moving fast. But if we look, and this thanks to Gartner at their hype model here, we've got an innovation trigger. It could be we're at the peak of inflated expectations. And for those who've been following our webinars, we have talked before about Amara's law, where the short-term impacts of a technology are overestimated and the long-term impacts are underestimated. And we've hypothesized that that law might apply now. Because although certainly there's plenty of improvement happening in these models, it's not obvious that the entire economy has shifted yet. That would be a short-term impact. But Amara's model would have you think, if it was true, that later on there will be a very significant impact. So you've still got to get somewhere on the learning curve. So there is hype. People are rushing to deployment, but they're rushing to deployment possibly, and we in many cases we do see this in an unstructured manner and disconnected and dispersed methods when you've actually got to focus cost, energy, effort, does mean that you're going to have less of an impact, which means you won't get the benefit. Also, If hype is unmanaged, you might find yourself quickly through the trough of disillusionment as put here. Then you need to really focus to get yourself into the slope of enlightenment, into the productivity plateau. So if you want to see AI make a difference on your numbers, what we're really saying is you do need some focus. So this is what we're often seeing. An awful lot of pressure from different departments and different parts of the organization to do something because they've read about or are otherwise aware of use cases which make their parts of the organization more relevant, sharper, more efficient, more creative, whatever it is that they want to use AI for. And plus, there's a way to pressure to know and use this stuff to look like and seem like and to actually be relevant. So needs are popping up all over the organization. And of course, it's okay for people to ask for lots of support. It's okay for people to ask for training. And in fact, we would argue that as part of an enablement strategy, which I'll come to, that we should make people aware. And there are applications that very broadly they can use. So for example, those SLMs, small language models that help you access knowledge in your organization, you can train people about them, and you can train people how to ingest information into them. So literally put data into them so that the machine can learn from it. All of that sort of training, very relevant and very sensible. And also even how to spot opportunities. But the challenge is, given the costs of a really big deployment that really changes, really hard pulls a lever to make a real difference, it's hard. So you've got some examples. Some people can say, I can save 25% of my time efficiency. AI tools can help me find data. That would be an efficiency, possibly even actually an effectiveness because you might not have found it. We can automate a task. That's efficiency. And we can use Gen AI to save time or to produce better content. So the examples are legion. But the problem is if you try to do everything at once, as we've said, there's undoubtedly some benefit, but it can be localized and it can be small. And the risks being introduced have wider impacts. So benefits of doing work everywhere, there'll be some local improvement. You can get some local improvement, but it's local. You can have increased staff familiarity and comfort with AI tools. And in fact, you can argue that that's necessary, and we'll argue that that is necessary in a few minutes' time. So you do need some degree of education and awareness and building comfort, and we'll come to that in a few minutes' time. And you may identify pathways of merit. So you can actually find ways to build your AI that makes a great deal of sense. But a drawback. If you're doing lots of work everywhere, how are you going to manage the risk of all of that? The more you do, the more risk. So it is worthwhile pausing for thought and thinking whether you've got your infrastructure in place to run, 50 experiments right across the organization. You can potentially introduce tech debt, particularly if you're using lots of different providers for your experiments. You can introduce process debt, particularly if you're using lots of different ways of examining process, or you're just introducing AI and not changing your process. You can have higher long-term costs because you're using lots of different providers, for example. Undirected experimentation can leave your resources too thin, which means you don't actually build the scale that you need to really make a difference. And lack of frameworks and oversight tend to lead to the poor realization of benefits. So there's an opportunity cost and there's risk. So if you actually boiled it down, you can increase the risk. You can actually potentially reduce the benefit because you're not leaning in to a basket of experiments that you can actually fund properly and pay enough attention to. So if those are the problems, the flip side of that is a strategy where you build a focused basket of experiments. Now, we're not saying that you only need to do one thing. We're just saying you need to be focused. And you can build a portfolio of experiments that you could scale should you find that the experiments work. Now, if you do it this way, you can lay foundations. So define objectives, assess current capability, and lay some foundations that actually allows you to deliver on those focus areas so you don't find that you're running along and you hit a brick wall, and you hit a brick wall because you haven't built the infrastructure required. On the other hand, because you know the focus areas, you don't need to build infrastructure you don't use yet. So that could save you money. And that knowing what infrastructure you needs allows you to progressively stack or staircase the building of a capability. So Improve, build some capability. Plateau, that's deploying and getting used to it. Build some more capability, plateau. And each time you plateau, you draw down some benefits by deploying. And that taking of a sequential approach allows you to build scalability safely. Focus areas and use cases for AI, therefore, can be selected based on business value and alignment with organizational goals, those elements of strategy that we talked about earlier. So those are some serious benefits. It allows you to manage risk. It allows you potentially, if you've chosen well, to get some very serious benefits. And bear in mind, it's not just where you choose to play, but it is to an extent how you build your infrastructure as well. Okay, so given all of this, how to proceed? So bear in mind, we have argued that AI has some inherent complexities, lots of places you can play, lots of different types of models, and actually lots that has to be done. So it's not quite as cheap as it looks. And if you try to do everything at once, you may be actually generating more risk and not actually be able to lean enough into the really big opportunities that you've got and fund them properly and give them the right attention. So if that is a reasonable hypothesis, and we certainly see plenty of evidence that it is, what should you do? Well, you should set up your organization to play safe. There are some minimums that you should consider, and we call those broadly the AI architecture component of this. And architecture, yes, is a much used word, but that's a way to think about it. Then you build internal capability. And whilst it's two, you can start building internal capability, but what you're going to build to a certain extent, and perhaps a large extent, depends on the portfolio of projects that you are going to build, know where you're going to play. So if you know where you're going to play, you can build the internal AI capability appropriately. So 2 and 3 will happen in parallel. In fact, actually, 1, 2, and 3 can all actually happen in parallel because they interact with each other. So you'll invest in the people and technology you need to get the first use cases done and perhaps the ones afterwards. And that takes us to where you're going to play. What we're not saying is that you keep AI to a group of pointy heads. You can absolutely have folks all throughout the organization learning about it and getting comfortable with it because they're all going to use it. And at the very least, they're going to be using and embedding in software that they've already got because your providers are already thinking about and acting upon their deploy AI in software you already use. But what you can do is build a portfolio. Now, we will be talking over the next weeks and months about risk management and a little bit more about risk intelligence, because in a world that's moving this fast, it's particularly important strategically, and it's particularly important in the operating model space. And part of risk intelligence is choosing the right portfolio to build. Not everything you choose will work. What you want is the basket of projects overall to give you a great return. A little bit like a venture capitalist will build a basket of different options, only a few of which might actually work. And now there's some thinking about how to manage that properly. We'll cover that in a vignette on risk management. So do watch out for that particular vignette because it'll help you think about how you build that basket of projects. But certainly the idea of building a basket of projects that's strategically relevant, that fits within your value driver T, that matches your risk appetite is a good idea. And of course, your risk appetite will determine how far away you're prepared to think about the technologies. You might be, for example, more inclined to work with technologies that are demonstrated and proven. And then prepare for the change to come. Now, you've already been messing with operating model, quite frankly, if you're setting yourself up to build an internal AI capability. But many are now thinking about what impact AI will have, for example, on their workforce model. And this is a very rational and reasonable thing to think about. Many people will say, yeah, but we don't know what will happen and we don't know when it will happen. One of the observations that we've noted is that there are people out there who've actually outlined the path that we're going on and that up to date, although timing has been mixed in terms of prediction, have been roughly right. So there are certain paths of improvement on AI models that you can reasonably assume in your planning are likely to happen. So these 4 elements, and bear in mind that there's certainly a degree of parallelism in these 4 elements. Now, when considering your organization's need, I'm just going to do a call out on this. It is important to think about your value driver tree. We always come back to this, or often come back to this, says really split your organization down into its component parts cognitively and hopefully in a numbers sense, so quantitatively, so you actually know where you're going to play and actually can build the business case as to how much change does your AI agent or agents need to deliver to be able to make a difference. So if you're targeting profit outcome and earnings before interest and tax, where are you going to play? You can improve customer service. How are you going to do that with AI capability? You're going to reduce operating costs. How are you going to do that? So you might be improving customer service using natural language processing. You might be reducing operating costs through automation. Bear in mind that there are automation tools that have been around for a while, actually, and they're actually getting quite mature. And it's not just core systems, but things like RPA. And then you can do enhanced risk management for other overheads, for example, and you can analyze different trends. So just in terms of that focus, do bear in mind the need to think about in a structured way your business. So I thought it's worthwhile stressing that before going. So let's finish off by an observation on the alternative strategies. So he said there are some unfocused strategy, and we call them the thousand flowers bloom. So, and this particular strategy of allowing everybody to have a go, it does actually have some benefits. And the benefits relate to enablement. In other words, having people become familiar with AI. But if we can't lean into them and if we can't fund them all, there's a potential also to create disappointment and drive people perhaps more quickly into that loop whereby they're driving into the disappointment part of the cycle. Now, a focus strategy tries to do a couple of things. So basically it tries to find a basket of winners, but there is a compromise, and we'll call it the enablement strategy. And we think this is a sensible way to go. So you have a focused basket of projects, but you're still happy to run other experiments. But more importantly, you're certainly happy to teach and train people and getting them to use sensible parts of your AI infrastructure. For example, you might have that small language model rather than a large language model that allows you to find materials inside the organization, or you might be experimenting with Copilot or something like that. An enablement strategy has a number of benefits. It works really well with the focus strategy. It says, look, it's not that we're going to fund everything or fund thousands of experiments. We're still going to be focused, but we'll teach people about AI and accelerate their ability to use some of the tools rather than build the tools. So you can present opportunities for a multitude of organizational personnel to become familiar with it, training and use of, consciously budget and resource groups to support experimentation. So you can still have some experimentation, but you manage the expectations. So the money's going into the focus areas, and you're quite clear on that, but you can rack and stack for later use and provide a way to prioritize organization strategy, but making sure that people know you're not going to fund everything, know that there'll have to be priorities, and make sure that we're managing the appropriate disappointment that can arise as a consequence. Okay. So there is a strong case for preparing an AI strategy. So it's important to think about where to play, absolutely, and think about portfolios you can build in focus areas. But as I've just said, you can also enable, train, and make sure people are aware of what AI can and cannot do, and actually make them very aware of how you're playing and how you're choosing to deploy. So you're going to have to figure out your AI architecture. How do you play safe in deploying these particular focus areas? And those will interact so that you can build more AI infrastructure as you build out your focus areas, and your organization will change. So you can think ahead as to what's likely to happen and how you're going to manage it. And of course, you'll have to build some AI capability anyway, because you must maintain it. And that's going to mean some early operating model changes. And I hope you'd agree we've argued a reasonable case that that's the case. And of course, we're here to help. And that brings me to an end of this particular webinar. We always do like to finish it nice and early. If you do want to ask some questions, there's the email to send the questions to, webinar@bevingtongroup.com. It's now just about to turn 9 o'clock, and we will finish right there. Have a great Friday and a wonderful weekend.